So, a bit of background. For those of you who do not know, I got into the Macintosh back in 2001 when I needed to switch over from Microsoft Windows for my graphics classes. As of this past year, I have been basically using Mac just about exclusively for the last 2 decades. I haven't even looked at Microsoft Windows since Windows XP. Okay? And I also got into Linux, and I've got a Linux system actually. I've got two Linux systems. I've got my Steam Deck, and I've got an old iMac that can no longer run Mac OS that I've put Linux onto. So I'm pretty well versed in that department as well. And as far as Apple, I have an iPad Pro, an iPad Mini, a MacBook Air, an Apple Watch, an Apple TV, pretty much the whole gamut, right? I'm pretty well versed for Apple. This past October, Microsoft held their Surface event, and I found it rather interesting for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being the integration between Apple's services, most notably iCloud Photos, which is going to be built into the Windows app. If you get the iCloud app, your iCloud photos will synchronize into Windows Photos. Apple TV and Apple Music apps will be coming to Microsoft Windows next year. And the other thing that really sparked my interest was Windows on ARM. I have a virtual machine of Windows on ARM here on my MacBook Air, but it can be a bit tricky when it comes to running assistive technology in virtual machines. For instance, the Macintosh has no insert key. And if you are a JAWS user, for example, you know very well that the insert key is the holy grail. Same with NVDA. Both of those apps run natively on Windows for ARM at this point, and they run really well, I might add. The other thing that I was interested in was the built-in 5G connectivity. As I mentioned before, I've got an iPad Pro. That particular model does have 5G, but you still have the limitations of iPadOS. iPadOS is coming a long way. They recently added windowed support, and to be honest, I'm using Stage Manager quite a bit, both on the iPad and on the Mac. But if there are certain things you need to get done that would be better served to a desktop and you're on the road, it can be easier sometimes to have the tablet. Now, if you need that full computing power with a tablet and you don't want to be watered down or limited, really, Windows tablets are pretty much the only game in town. And again, that's for full desktop computing in a tablet form factor if you can, if that's what you want to go for. And again, it's been well over 20 years since I looked into Microsoft Windows. And I'm noticing that there are a lot more similarities these days than there are differences. Apple's got AirDrop, for example. Microsoft has got nearby sharing. Apple has got FaceTime, Microsoft has got Teams. And once again, you're looking at the integration. Apple is bringing Apple Music over to Windows. Well, we've got Microsoft Office on the Mac and on iPadOS. So I think that there are a lot more similarities these days than there are differences. One of the things that I really, really like. So I contacted Freedom Scientific a couple of weeks ago because I was so impressed with JAWS. I was wondering, how are we looking as far as Zoom Text and Fusion on Windows for ARM? They said it would be at least a year, but depending on your needs, you might not even need it. If you can get by with the standard Windows magnifier, they've added quite a few additional features, such as text cursor highlighting and customizable cursor themes. The big thing, though, for me was I discovered recently Microsoft Edge Immersive Reading. it's almost like having the ZoomText web reader, and I said almost because it doesn't have near as many customization options, but it's like having the ZoomText web reader built into Microsoft Edge on all platforms. Now, I will say that Read Aloud is available on all platforms, but if you want the full immersive reader experience, you have to use Windows. The only real issue that I've had with Windows on ARM so far is the Affinity Suite. Oh, and Adobe, of course, but we're not going to talk about that. So yeah, the other thing is everything appears to be everywhere these days. For example, just the other day, I was in the Windows 11 virtual machine. I went on to Edge. I logged into Apple Music, and I was able to listen to my library there, right? Back in the day, back when I first started and I was building up my library of Apple, photos, music, what have you, and iTunes, iPhoto, what have you, it was pretty much you were stuck in that system. But nowadays, even Apple is looking into getting more into services, which we're seeing they're getting more into cross-platform with exceptions. I don't know if Apple will ever port FaceTime over to Windows or Pages, over to Windows. So there are some exceptions, and it is because of those exceptions that I am never abandoning Apple. Okay, I am never abandoning Apple. But I'm up to my ears in the ecosystem, and I've decided that I'm going to use all three. I've been using Gmail for many years. I've been using iCloud for several years. And I've decided that I'm going to give Microsoft a try. Again, it's been 2 decades. They've really stepped up their game. Windows on ARM is something that I'm genuinely excited about. So I've put onto my wish list this year a Microsoft Surface Pro 9 SQ3 5G. Specifically the 8 gigs of RAM and the 256 gig storage. And I tried the Surface in person. I'm very excited for what the Surface Pen has to offer and how it might differ from the Apple Pencil. This is an adventure the way I see it. A lot of people are like, oh, Mac versus PC, one's better than the other. These days, I think things are a lot more even than we realize. If you dig hard enough, which is what I did because I got curious, so I did some research, there are a lot more similarities nowadays than there are differences, I think. And again, I've got my MacBook Air, I've got my iPhone, I've got my iPad mini, I've got my iPad Pro, I've got my Apple TV, I've got my Apple Watch, so I'm very well versed in Apple right now. I've got Linux, specifically KDE Neon at the moment, running on my 8-year-old iMac, since it can no longer run Mac OS, as I said before. And I've got Linux also on my Steam Deck. So in a sense, I do have a gaming PC. It may not be a top-of-the-line, true, multi-$1,000 insane gaming rig with flashing lights, what have you. But it's definitely very usable for my gaming needs. So really the only gap is Microsoft, and I am genuinely interested. The other thing that I like is how they are open to accessibility. They've openly said that they're going to have their live caption system made available if it isn't already available. They've got this adaptive kit that you can take accessories and adapt them to your needs. It's really exciting to see where everybody's going, not just Microsoft, but where everybody's going. And that's why I'm thinking about the Surface. I'd like to give it a try. I'd like to see how Windows is, and I do think that I'm going to find a use for all of it. I'm going to find a use for Google. I'm going to find a use for Apple, and I'm going to find a use for Microsoft. As an example as to what those uses might be, so I could see myself using Apple for my leisure stuff, right? For recording videos like this one, watching Apple TV, watching, Crunchyroll, that sort of thing. Google, I often tend to use more than I'd like to admit because I tend to prefer their search results. as well as translating, because I do talk to people from other countries whose primary language is not English, and having to translate, I do prefer, depending on the language, of course. Japanese is just nuts. But there are times when Apple's own translator app falls short and I have to use Google's translator app. Okay. And then Microsoft for, for immersive reading on websites, gaming, productivity. Because unfortunately, ZoomText, since it was bought out by Freedom Scientific and is no longer part of AI Squared because they went under, ZoomText is no longer available on the Mac. So a lot of those special reading features have been lost. Unless you want to, of course, pay for something like Read and Write, which I haven't used for a long time and I think requires a business subscription or something. So, as I said before, if you want something that's a built-in option, 20 or so years ago, back in 2001, 2002, Apple was at the forefront. They had a full screen magnifier. Microsoft didn't have that till Windows 7. In 2005, they had VoiceOver. And these days, Narrator has improved, but it's still kind of bleh. So you have to get, I personally prefer NVDA, which runs on Windows on ARM beautifully. In fact, I like NVDA so much that I've started supporting them financially. So, and again, because you can access your Google services from anywhere, your Microsoft services from anywhere, and increasingly you're being able to access your Apple Entertainment services from almost anywhere because Apple's dipping more into the services market. I think that we're getting to a point where the feud between the various platforms is pretty much moot because everything's going to be available on everything at one point. And it's just going to come down to user preference. And me, I like all of it. So that's my reasoning for those of you who thought I'd lost my mind. What do you think? Thank you for watching. Comments are welcome. And have a nice day.